Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to have 3 topics in one video. It's going to be 3 different race riots from the 1900s through the 1960s. There were a few, but I chose just 3 to talk about. The 3 are going to be the Chicago race riot of 1919, the Knoxville race riot of 1919, and the Elaine, Arkansas riot of 1919. So without further ado, let's get straight into the video. Okay, so our very first topic is going to be the Chicago race riot of 1919. This began on July 27th, 1919, when large crowds of white people and black people went to the Lake Michigan beach in Chicago, Illinois to basically get relief from all the heat that was going on. And then an angry dispute began over a stoning of a young African American man named Eugene Williams, who was a swimmer who, I guess, went into a segregated boundary in the white swimming area. And the white people did not like that whatsoever. White people began to throw stones at the young man, causing him to drown. And when police refused to arrest any of the white people who were accused by the African Americans that were around that witnessed it, they basically arrested a black African American person who was at the beach on a white person's complaint of some minor offense. And then that's when the African Americans really got sick and tired of the situation, and they actually attacked the police officer. Then reports of this incident began to spread throughout Chicago, which began a huge riot across the south side of the city. After this time and tension began to simmer a lot, the incident released years of racial tension, and it started to constrict the job market and all the efforts for African Americans to secure housing by moving into all previously white neighborhoods. And as that began, African Americans began arriving in the city during that time, which was the period of the Great Migration. For 7 days straight, it was a riot on the streets of Chicago, where many African Americans became victims of the white mobs that had passed through the white neighborhoods in order to reach their workplaces in order for housing, while others were attacked on streetcars or taken out their cars or homes in city parks and other public places. And the majority of the violence and rioting was concentrated in the Black Belt section, which is known as the predominantly black neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. At the height of all the rioting, over 4/5 of Chicago's 3,000 police officers had been sent to control these mobs, and a lot of African Americans were forced to stay home because of the mobs that were out in the streets. And they often weren't as safe there as the white mobs because they began to torch houses in the neighborhoods, and African Americans tried to fight back, but the white neighborhoods had more superiority in the aspect of numbers of people and firepower and even sympathy of the police. So by the end of this entire situation, the violence of around 23 to 40 black African Americans had died, while only 5 predominantly white people had died, with more than 500 people injured and about 1,000 people left homeless because of all the burnt down businesses and homes. There were no way to make money or to provide for their family or even keep their homes because it was burnt down. They didn't have any belongings at that point or any other really thing that had any worth at that point. And after all of this, nobody was confined or arrested for the situation whatsoever. And then they had to move on to trying to rebuild the south side of Chicago. Okay, so the next topic is going to be the Knoxville race riot of 1919. The Knoxville race riot in Knoxville, Tennessee was one of many race riots that took place in what they called the Red Summer of 1919 because it was a series of violent riots, predominantly whites against blacks, which lasted from May until October of that year. and resulted in around 600 deaths across the nation. So this riot began on August 30th, 1919, when an intruder entered the home of Bertie Lindsay, I think I'm pronouncing that right, a 27-year-old white woman, and shot her while she was asleep in her bed. The only witness was Lindsay's 21-year-old cousin, Ora Smith, who soon after the intruder left their home in Knoxville stole a purse on his way out, and then ran next door to the house of a city policeman. One of the officers investigating the crime scene immediately accused Maurice Mays. Maurice Franklin Mays was a well-known African American political figure who served as a deputy in North Knoxville, but afterwards he kind of got into gambling and bootlegging, and he started managing a cafe on East Jackson Avenue located in Knoxville, and he became the father of the foster child William Mays, who was a former slave, and his wife Frances Mays. Around 3:30 a.m. on August 30th, Andy White, along with two other officers, traveled to May's apartment where they found a revolver in his dresser. Soon after, White handcuffed Mays and hauled him over to the crime scene, where Ora identified him as the intruder after barely glancing at him. Maurice says that he was then taken to the Knox County jailhouse. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, angry white people began to congregate near Knox County Jail, and a few people broke into the jail to search for Mays. However, he was already moved to a jail in Chattanooga, Tennessee as a protective measure. No African American inmates were harmed during their search, but over a dozen white inmates were freed, leading to the pillaging of the liquor storage room and the demolition of the jail. Later that day, the National Guardsmen were notified about several holdups taking place in the black section of Knoxville near Vine Avenue and Central Street by a band of African Americans, but not long after, a detachment was sent to the scene, followed by a mob of white rioters. Although only one business was broken into by African Americans, the white mob raided and destroyed numerous black-owned businesses in the area. Eventually, guardsmen joined the mob, engaging in gunfire with black residents. In the end, hundreds of citizens were wounded and 7 people were killed, 6 black and 1 was white. The riot then prompted many African Americans to flee the city, and even though Knoxville started as just a murder case and not a race riot, in the end it really did, because Maurice Franklin Mays was convicted of the murder of Bertie Lindsay by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. And from all of that, it caused days worth of rioting and homes destroyed and businesses, leaving hundreds of people homeless and lots of people without way to get back to pretty much having what they used to have, getting them back into work so they can be able to get back to what they used to have. And then the building once again began there, even though a lot of people were convinced to stay away from the area because of this incident. Okay, so the very last riot I'm going to be talking about is the Lane, Arkansas riot of 1919. It was one of the last major riots of the Red Summer, and in this racial massacre, the numbers of deaths are unknown, but it is estimated that over 200 African Americans were killed, 5 whites, during this entire hysteria of persecution of black sharecroppers. All of this concerted effort to drive African Americans out of Phillips County in Arkansas, and it was so jarring that Ida B. Wells, the founder of the NAACP, published a short book on the riot in 1920. It's also widely reported that African American newspapers like the Chicago Defender generated public campaigns to address this fallout. So, on the night of September 30th, 1919, approximately 100 African Americans, mainly sharecroppers on the plantations of white landowners, attended a meeting of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America at a church in Hoopsburg, a small community outside of the Phillips County area in Arkansas, and they hoped to organize to obtain better payments for their cotton crops. But They were highly already aware of white fears of communist influence on the black community, and the Union posted armed guards around the church to prevent disruption and infiltration. During the meeting, three white men pulled up to the front of the church and asked one of the guards a question. After the guard didn't answer, gunfire erupted after no response was made. Though there is a lot of debate as to who fired first, the guards killed W.A. Adkins, who was a security officer from the Missouri Pacific Railroad, and injured Charles Pratt, the deputy sheriff. The next morning, an all-white group of armed men went to arrest the suspects. Though they encountered some opposition from the black community, the fact was that the blacks outnumbered the whites 10-1 on this situation in the area of Arkansas, which resulted in what they called the Great Insurrection. The concerned white folks formed a mob numbering up to 1,000 armed men who came from surrounding counties as far away as Mississippi and Tennessee. When they reached Elaine, the mob began killing black people and ransacking their homes. As word of the attack spread throughout the African American community, some black residents fled while others armed themselves in defense. The mob then turned its decision to disarming those blacks who fought, while local white newspapers inflamed tension by reporting that there were planned black uprisings. So basically, they heard that African Americans were coming up with a plan to disarm them instead. And by October 2nd, the U.S. Army troops arrived in Elaine and the white mobs began to disperse. The federal troops even joined some of these white mobs and rounded up several hundred of African Americans and put them in temporary stockades, where there were reports of torture and murder. The men were not released until their white employers vouched for them, which was also considerable because there was no evidence whatsoever. So many of the soldiers that sent to quell the violence engaged in the systematic killing of the black residents. In the end, 122 blacks but no whites were charged by the Phillips County grand jury for crimes related to the riot, and their court-appointed lawyers did little in their defense despite any evidence and investigation, and they were automatically convicted and sentenced to death. As a result, 65 others entered plea bargains and accepted up to 21 years for second-degree murder. Led by one of the black attorneys in the area, the NAACP and other civil rights groups worked towards the retrials, but none of them were set free or won their release.